Hi, so I've been asked to pass on a few tips and tricks of what I learnt about welding because I've been welding only for a few months, and actually it took me about 2 weeks to learn to be proficient enough so that I could make stuff. So I'm not pretending to be an expert welder. I'm not a genius at it. I can weld stuff together, and with the aid of an angle grinder I can make it look good. But I did learn very quickly and are now making all kinds of stuff. And I would encourage anybody who's thinking about picking up welding but scared of it to pick up welding and stop being scared of it, because to be honest, it's like any skill, you get better with practice, but it is particularly easy to do a job even if that job is bad. Bad in welding terms means it looks ugly. Bad in my terms means it breaks. Good in my terms means if it stays there and you can ride it over some hilly ground, you've done a good weld. You want it to look pretty? Well, take the grinder to it and some paint, it'll look pretty. So as long as you can, in my view, as long as you can weld two bits of metal together so they stick together and stay together, you're a welder. And I know that is horrendous as a view, because real welders do an awfully good job. So I say, I'm not pretending to be a welder. I've learnt to weld in a way that suits me just fine and helps me make machines. Now, I have tried two kinds of welders. I've tried a transformer welder, which actually weighs a ton. And the surprising thing is how often you carry this thing around. So if you're carrying that big old weight around, to be honest, most of the time you can't be bothered getting out the shelf because it weighs so much. Luckily, these modern welders actually, they're capacitive discharge welders as opposed to being transformer-based welders, and they're just unbelievably light. So they're really easy to tote around, and that matters. This welding, it seems to me, is all about how you approach the workpiece. So I really like welder, it's good. I think this was in the sort of £125 region. It is an X-Cort MMA 300E. It's now discontinued. I don't know why, but it is discontinued. And I think they're now doing something called the 350E, which has a very pretty little digital display, which this is lacking. It's very basic. All I can control are the amps. And for that, I found it immensely useful because it's easy to use. Basically, the thinner the metal, the lower the amps. The thicker the metal, the higher the amps. Now, I don't think about any specific amp setting. What I do is do a bit, and when I burn a hole in it, I curse myself and turn the amps down. That's about it. After a little bit, you get used to the kind of amp range for the metal that you're going to be welding. So, for instance, if I'm welding a bike frame, and that's about 0.5 millimetre thick, I'll put it at 95 amps, because I know if I put it at 165, I'm going straight the way through, and I have to fill all those holes. So you get used to it very quickly when you're welding very similar metals to give you the range of amps that you need. The other thing is these rods. I mean, I use almost entirely, it's written on it actually, there we go, E6013. They're the standard rod. They've got the flux coating on the outside, a bit of steel on the inside, leaves a big ugly amount of flux on the top that you have to whack off with a hammer, but they are the universal rod that I use for welding all of the steel work, and to date they've done an awesome job. Now, they do come in different thicknesses. You can get really thin rods, which again you use for thin metal, or you get these super chunky rods here, which I use for very thick metal because you're laying down a lot of metal. So if you're using thin rods on thick metal, you'll basically just eat up the rods as you lay that metal down, and you'll go through them at a rate of knots. So I use the thicker rods because they can cope with the heat and they lay a lot of metal down quickly. The thin rods need less heat. So the thinner something is, the less heat you give it, the less likely you are to burn through it. So, thin metal, low amps, thin rods. Thick metal, high amps, thick rods. That's about all. I've got a couple of chunks of metal here. It's about 3 millimetres, that's about 1.5 millimetres. If I want to weld these together, what I do is obviously clean off all the dross. So it will burn through, but it does leave a messy weld and it does choke you and it's a lot of fumes. So clean off the dross with an angle grinder so you're back to bare metal. Put your two bits of metal together and support them somehow. And support them anyway. I mean, I use blocks of steel that I just shove up against the things and put a tack weld in it so that I can take the steel away. So support your workpiece so that it's got the right setting that you want, and poke at it with the rod until you get the arc. The arc will strike. Now the first time you strike that arc, you're going to jump back, okay, because it goes fizz, bang, pop, and it's a bright light, and you're going to jump back. And you have to get used to that. And that's part of what the practice is that not jumping back bit. Because when you jump back, you snatch it away, and the whole thing stops immediately. The other thing is poking it in there. If you poke it in there a bit too hard, it'll weld the rod to the metal and the whole thing will stick, so you have to break it off. That's a bit of a pain. So it's about getting that distance right to strike the arc, but hold the rod a little bit away from the surface and you'll find a pool of metal will form. When you form that pool of metal, it will run as you move that rod. And these are things that you see as you're doing it. You've really got to practice it. But the essential information I'm giving you here is don't poke it in too hard. Try not to jump back when you see the arc strike. And of course, you'll fail on both of those on the first 2 tries that you give it. But after a little bit, if you're persistent with it, within about half an hour, you're going to be fine. You're not going to be scared. So try not to weld like this. Try to weld like this so that you have much more control over things. But of course, you've got this massive temperature, fumes coming off, electricity everywhere. So you're going to want to weld like this to begin with, and that is the worst thing that most people do. You have no control. You can't see what you're doing. You can't hold that rod. Now some people are purists. They'll put this in the holder and the holder just the holder. Me, I can't do that, so I hold it there and do it like that. So I've got control of the rod. When my fingers get a bit hot, well, I take them off or I move it up, but I hold the rod so that I can actually control what it is I'm doing. Now that metal will flow, quite literally, it will flow. So if you've got something like this, and you're trying to weld that bit together, and you start your weld here, the hot metal will actually just run all the way down. If you start your weld here, at the bottom, the hot metal will pool there. Now what I tend to do with those kind of things is I start here and go down and let that metal run into the bit that I'm actually forming. Equally, if I'm trying to weld something like that and I approach it this way, all that metal is just going to drop off. It's going to drop off and burn your shoes. So if you want to weld something like that, just try and make sure it's facing that way. If you're trying to get into a weld, face it that way, so the metal will pool in the V where it wants to. If you've got it that way, it'll run off in that direction. If you've got it that way, it'll run off in that direction. If it's like that, it'll run into the V. So that's what I meant about moving this and moving your workpiece. So when I'm welding something like that, I pop it down, tack weld, so that it holds it in place. Then I can point that any way I want. And I do move my workpiece to pay attention to the flow of the metal so that the metal can run into the work that I'm doing instead of running off the work that I'm doing. And that makes a big difference actually to what it is that you're doing. Now, burning holes is something I frequently do because I'm not the greatest welder by any means. So when I burn a hole, so say I've got a hole here, I will angle this, put some weld metal here and let it run into the hole. And it'll fill the hole all by itself, unless it's like that, in which case it won't run into the hole, which is really a cool little trick I found. The other thing I do is I chop off bits of rod and put it into the hole so the rod will catch the hot metal running into it. Then I snap it off and grind it down and that fills any holes I've been burning in stuff. And it's, I think, a neat little trick to be using. When it comes to the ancillary equipment, incidentally, then this thing is worth its weight in gold at about 20 quid. It is an auto-sensing helmet. I've tried the ones where they're dark and you just cannot see what it is you're doing until the arc is struck. So you're more or less welding by feel, which is not great. This one, you can see what it is you're doing as soon as the arc strikes, darkens off and protects you. Brilliant, worth its money, worth its weight in gold. Anywhere between 20 and 40 pounds is going to buy you a very nice one. These things. Originally I bought a red set, I think they were a £5 or something like that. Now they were warm, they were, protected me from the heat, because the gloves, that's what they protect you from. They don't protect you from the current, because the current is immensely high, but the voltage is immensely low. The voltage is so low you could probably grab the rods and just hold on to them and nothing would happen to you, because it has to be above 50 volts to go through your body. This voltage is very low, the current is very high, so it's the heat that's the killer, not the current. So these things need to stand up to the heat. And the red gloves actually cooked, and what I found was that the fingers curled and I just couldn't hold things because I couldn't open up the leather. So a decent set of gloves actually is worth buying. So I paid, I think, £20 for these gloves instead of the £5 gloves, and I found them to be really good. The leather's not burning and it's not restricting the movement of my fingers, because you very often want to hold on to a piece. So some decent gloves, a decent helmet, and then one of these modern capacitive welders is going to get you going. Now the welders are going to be in the price of sort of £100 to £200. If you're going over that for a beginning welder, you're probably being a bit crazy. If you're going under that, then you're probably buying a transformer type, which is do the job, but it's a little bit heavy. So somewhere around about that price range, and there's just such a lot of those machines around that I can't recommend any particular one. I mean, this is the first one I bought and I get on with it just fine, but I bought it because it was a lightweight capacitive welder that I could control the amps on. Anyway, I can't think of anything else more to say about it, about how I picked that up so quickly. But I think the key element really is move your workpiece with the thought of where the flow of the metal is. Try not to be afraid of it and get in there in the welding, because you need to control the rod. If you're not controlling the rod movement, your weld's going to be pretty bad. Remember, for me, a bad weld is one that breaks. If I have to put a load of metal in there to make that thing hold, I'll put a load of metal in there to make that thing hold. I'm not doing professional standard welding, I'm doing home welding to make machinery for me. So I hope all that information helped. I hope you enjoyed the video, and thank you very much for watching.